Let me be very precise about something before we go any further. Most people watching events unfold in the Strait of Hormuz are asking the wrong question entirely. They are asking, will China intervene militarily? That is the wrong question. That is the question of someone who still thinks in 20th century categories, who still imagines that power projection requires aircraft carriers and boots on the ground. The real question, the one that determines everything, is this. At what point does Washington's blockade become a direct attack on Beijing's economic sovereignty? Because the moment you understand that framing, everything that has happened in the last 6 weeks snaps into focus with terrifying clarity. Washington made a catastrophic miscalculation. It assumed that because China would not fire a missile, China would comply. That assumption is the single most dangerous idea circulating inside the Beltway right now. And history, not opinion, not ideology. History tells us exactly what happens to empires that confuse an adversary's patience with an adversary's submission. Let us go back to the beginning. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran, assassinating Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and targeting nuclear infrastructure. Iran responded the only way it structurally could by closing the Strait of Hormuz. Now 20% of the world's petroleum and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas moves through that narrow choke point. When Iran shut it, the global economy did not simply experience disruption. It experienced the functional equivalent of a cardiac arrest. Oil prices spiked, supply chains fractured. The United Kingdom called it deeply damaging. The European Commission called the closure greatly damaging. These are not the words of governments choosing a side. These are the words of economies watching their arteries close. But here's what Washington fundamentally misread. It assumed that the party most threatened by the closure of the strait was Iran. It was not. The party most structurally threatened by that closure over the medium and long term was China. Beijing is the largest buyer of Iranian crude on Earth. The payments, according to Lloyd's List, were already being processed in Chinese yuan, not dollars, yuan. Think carefully about what that single data point tells you about the trajectory of the global financial order. The petrodollar was not simply being challenged in theory. It was being bypassed in practice at the precise moment that Washington chose to escalate. Now, game theory teaches us something essential about moments like this. When you place an actor in a position where compliance costs more than defiance, you do not get compliance. You get defiance wrapped in the language of diplomacy, executed through actions that are technically ambiguous, but strategically unambiguous. China did not need to fire a shot. China needed only to send a tanker. A Chinese-owned vessel, the Rich Starry, ran the U.S. blockade after first appearing to turn around in the strait. Salon, read that sentence again. After first appearing to turn around. That is not a navigation error. That is a performance. That is Beijing sending a message written not in diplomatic cable language but in maritime movement, the language that empires have always understood. The ship belongs to Shanghai Xueqin Shipping Company, already sanctioned by the United States, which means Beijing chose with full legal knowledge of the consequences to run a vessel through a blockade enforced by the most powerful navy in human history. That is not recklessness. That is a calculated, calibrated signal. And Washington, for all its military capability, was not prepared for it. Let us now zoom out to the structural level, because individual events only become meaningful when you can see the pattern they belong to. What we are witnessing is not simply a dispute over Iranian oil exports. What we are witnessing is the first genuine test of whether the United States can enforce economic compliance on a great power, a peer competitor in the 21st century. Every previous blockade the U.S. has enforced has been against nations that lack the geopolitical weight to resist. Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, Iraq. These were nations that could be isolated because no major power was willing to absorb the cost of defending them. Iran is different. Iran is not isolated. Iran sits at the center of a web of relationships with China, with Russia, with the broader non-Western world that makes true isolation structurally impossible. China called the U.S. blockade of the Strait of Hormuz a dangerous and irresponsible act that would further inflame tensions in the region, with Foreign Ministry spokesman Xueqin stating that only a full ceasefire can help ease the situation. CNBC, now diplomatic language, is always dense with meaning that the casual reader misses. When Beijing says dangerous and irresponsible, it is not simply registering disapproval, it is serving notice. It is drawing a line in the language that Beijing prefers, the language of formal diplomatic statement before it draws that line in action, and then it drew it in action. A Chinese tanker broke the blockade. By April 20th, at least 26 ships had managed to bypass the U.S. blockade line in both directions. Wikipedia 26 ships. The blockade that was announced with the full weight of American military power, over 10,000 U.S. personnel, more than a dozen warships, dozens of aircraft, was being eroded not by Iranian military resistance, but by the commercial logic of nations who could not afford to comply. This is the trap. This is the exact trap that structurally predictable imperial overreach always produces. Washington has now placed itself in a position where enforcing the blockade means directly confronting Chinese commercial vessels, which means directly confronting Chinese economic sovereignty. which means directly confronting China. And not confronting China means watching the blockade dissolve ship by ship, tanker by tanker, until the instrument of pressure becomes an instrument of humiliation. China was not notified about the U.S. military operations against Iran beforehand. Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. That is a detail that Washington's architects of this campaign may have considered a minor diplomatic discourtesy. Beijing experienced it as a declaration of intent. When the world's second-largest economy, one with which you are deeply economically entangled, is not consulted before you launch a war that closes 20% of global oil trade. You have not simply bypassed a courtesy, you have communicated a worldview. You have communicated that in Washington's strategic calculus, Beijing's economic interests are not considerations to be negotiated, but obstacles to be managed. And Beijing heard that message with crystal clarity. Now, let us apply the historical lens because what we are witnessing has a precedent. Not an exact precedent, history never repeats identically, but a structural precedent that psychohistorical analysis can identify with confidence. Think about the moment in the Peloponnesian War when Athens decided to extend its power to Sicily. The Athenians were not wrong about their military capability. They were wrong about the cost of using it. They could project power. They could not sustain the projection against a resistance that understood at a structural level that Athens was overextended. The Sicilian expedition was not lost because Athens was weak. It was lost because Athens was strong in the wrong dimension at the wrong moment. The United States today is strong, extraordinarily strong. Its navy is without parallel. Its logistics are without parallel. Its ability to project kinetic force across the globe is without parallel. But kinetic force cannot solve an economic equation. You cannot bomb a supply chain back into compliance when the supply chain is routed around you. You cannot threaten into submission a power whose response to your threat is to reroute its commercial vessels through the very corridor you are trying to seal. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. It is in the physical sense a narrow passage. In the geopolitical sense, it is a mirror. And what Washington is seeing in that mirror right now should be deeply unsettling. Iran began controlling traffic through the strait and charging tolls of over 1 million per ship. Wikipedia. Let that number sit with you for a moment. Iran, a country whose military, the President of the United States claimed had been entirely destroyed, was charging $1 million per vessel passage, and ships were paying. Not because they wanted to pay Iran, because the alternative was worse. Because the global economy cannot survive the indefinite closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and actors respond to structural incentives, not to the preferences of Washington. According to Lloyd's List, payments were being assessed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Chinese yuan. Wikipedia Chinese yuan, not dollars. The petrodollar, the architecture of American financial dominance built since the Nixon era, was not simply being challenged. It was being dismantled in real time at the choke point of the world's most critical energy corridor, with payments processed in the currency of the nation that Washington expected would comply with its blockade. This is what Beijing's ultimatum actually means. It is not a threat of war. Beijing is far too strategically sophisticated to issue threats of war when economic action achieves the same result at a fraction of the cost and with none of the escalatory risk. China's ultimatum is structural. It is written in the movement of tankers in the denomination of payments. In the veto at the United Nations Security Council, China and Russia vetoed a draft resolution on the Strait of Hormuz's House of Commons library, and in the quiet, steady refusal to treat Washington's economic pressure as legitimate. The message is simple. The Strait of Hormuz is not an American lake. Iranian oil is not an American resource to blockade, and China's economic lifeline is not a bargaining chip in someone else's war. Washington now faces a choice that no amount of military power can simplify. It can enforce the blockade against Chinese vessels and risk a direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed peer competitor at a moment when its military is already stretched across an active conflict with Iran. Or it can watch the blockade fail ship by ship and absorb the strategic humiliation of a declared policy being openly defied by the world's second-largest economy without consequence. There is no third option that preserves both American credibility and American restraint. The trap has closed. And this is the lesson that every aspiring hegemon eventually learns. Not from textbooks, not from think tanks, but from the actual structure of power as it plays out over decades and centuries. Dominance is not a permanent condition. It is a temporary equilibrium sustained only as long as the costs of challenging it exceed the costs of accepting it. The moment you force a great power to calculate that those costs have flipped, the moment China must choose between absorbing the economic damage of blockade compliance and absorbing the reputational damage of public defiance, you have already lost the strategic game, regardless of how many warships you have in the water. The blockade did not break because China fired a missile. The blockade broke because China sent a tanker. And that single distinction tells you everything you need to know about how power actually operates in the 21st century, and why the nation that understands that distinction will write the history of this era, while the nation that doesn't will become a cautionary chapter within it.